Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take stacks of sources, research notes, and historical narratives, and try to distill all that chaos into the insight you need to be truly well-informed.
And today we are heading on what is probably one of the most tragic and just plain bizarre journeys in European history.
We're tracking the life of Charles VI of France.
This is a story that, honestly, it reads like a classical tragedy. You have a king who governed for 42 years, but his life is this perfect, horrifying illustration of how a single, devastating mental illness can completely shatter a nation.
Right, and lead it to the very brink of foreign conquest and, well, civil annihilation.
And the sources. The sources saddle him with these two nicknames that are so contradictory, they're almost unbelievable.
The first one is the beloved Le Bien-Aimé.
Yeah, which he earned during this brief, successful window when things were going really well.
And the second one?
The Mad, Le Fou, or Le Fou. And that's the name that ultimately defined not just him, but his entire era.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack that, to trace his life from this, promising start through the really disturbing manifestations of his psychosis.
Which were often spectacular and very, very public.
Exactly. And then understand precisely how this personal disaster created a power vacuum that just fractured the French state.
A vacuum that ultimately allowed Henry V of England to seize the advantage and, for a time, completely dominate France during the late Hundred Years' War.
Okay, so the starting line here is absolutely essential. Charles VI was born in 1368, and when he was crowned, he was only 11 years old. This was in 1380.
And at that point, he was in an enviably strong position.
Yeah.
His father, Charles V, was an incredibly astute ruler. They called him the Wise for a reason.
Right. He rebuilt the royal finances, he professionalized the army, he was actively driving the English back.
So Charles VI inherits this really favorable military and political situation. But as we're about to see, that strength was, well, it was squandered almost immediately.
The irony is just crushing, isn't it? He reigned all the way until 1422, which is a long time.
A very long tenure. But his true control, the period where he was actually a successful, functional monarch, was incredibly short-lived.
First, it was dominated by these self-interested regents.
Yeah.
His uncles.
And then, tragically, it was completely eclipsed by the onset of these severe psychotic episodes that began when he was only 24. It's a 42-year chronicle of catastrophic decline.
So let's start where all the trouble really began, the minority. Charles VI is crowned in November 1380. Now, the official age of majority was 14.
But the powerful men around him, his uncles, they successfully argued to extend the regency until he was 20.
So who were these men and what were their real interests? Because it certainly wasn't the stability of France.
Not really. These were the powerful dukes, all brothers of the late Charles V, plus one maternal uncle. In order of, let's say, influence, you had Philip II, the Duke of Burgundy. He immediately took the dominant role.
Okay.
Then there was Louis I, Duke of Anjou, John, Duke of Berry, and finally Louis II, Duke of Bourbon, the maternal uncle.
It sounds like a recipe for political fragmentation right from the start.
It was, and that's exactly what happened. Take Louis of Anjou, for example. He had these grand, incredibly distracting ambitions elsewhere.
You wanted a kingdom in Italy, right?
Precisely. He spent years, starting in 1382, fighting for the kingdom of Naples to assert his claim there. He was completely focused on an Italian kingdom, not the French treasury, right up until he died in 1384.
And John of Berry, was he any better?
He was similarly distracted, though a bit closer to home. His focus was almost entirely on maximizing his own extensive interests and wealth in Languedoc in the south of France.
He was a famous patron of the arts, though. The Tragicles du Duc de Berry.
An incredible patron of the arts, yes, but a terrible public servant. He was far more concerned with building his magnificent chateau and acquiring these beautiful illuminated manuscripts than he was with actually governing France.
So that leaves the maternal uncle, Louis II, Duke of Bourbon.
The sources describe him as the least consequential, eccentric, largely unimportant politically. It is worth noting, though, that he himself was known to display signs of mental instability.
That's an unsettling bit of foreshadowing, isn't it?
It really is an unsettling precursor, perhaps, to the illness that would soon grip the family's young king.
So you have four men who are supposed to be governing the kingdom, but only one, Philip the Bold of Burgundy, is really active in the core decision-making.
And his focus was entirely self-serving. This led directly to the central problem of the early regency, the systematic and incredibly rapid financial mismanagement of the entire kingdom.
Right. because their father, Charles V, had been so careful. He'd painstakingly built up the royal treasury, accumulated wealth, secured loans.
He ensured fiscal stability. But the dukes, they saw this accumulated wealth not as state resources, but as like a giant inheritance, a personal cash machine for their own ambitions.
The sources on this are pretty damning, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They centralized power specifically to achieve their financial aims. They got rid of Charles V's competent administrators, and critically, they reversed Charles V's popular deathbed decision to repeal several highly unpopular taxes, known as the Aids.
So they weren't just squandering money, they were actively alienating the population for personal gain.
Exactly. They needed cash for Burgundy's expansion, for Anjou's Neapolitan adventure, for Berry's luxury spending, and they were going to get it, no matter the cost to the kingdom's stability.
Reversing a popular tax repeal has to be one of the quickest ways to trigger urban unrest.
And that's exactly what happened, almost immediately. It resulted in significant tax revolts all across the kingdom, collectively known as the Harrowing.
The Harrowing, what does that name mean?
It comes from the rallying cry, the Harrow, which was a cry of alarm. It began in Rouen and just spread like wildfire throughout northern France.
So this was a massive urban uprising.
It was. It was a huge popular movement against the arbitrary reimposition of these taxes. And it just goes to show how quickly the legitimacy and the goodwill that Charles V had earned were completely destroyed by the Duke's sheer greed. The crown was immediately unstable the moment its strong hand was removed.
And their political decisions in foreign affairs were just as self-interested. You mentioned the Battle of Ryswick in 1382.
That battle is the perfect example of the Dukes manipulating the French state for private gain. Ryswick was fought against the Flemings led by Philip van Artevelde.
And this was a revolt that threatened Philip the Bold of Burgundy's interest in Flanders.
Significantly, his territorial and economic interests. So the French army, the king's forces, were essentially deployed for one reason, to protect the private domain of Duke of Burgundy.
Further draining resources and diverting attention from the actual war against England.
Precisely. During this period, France was less a kingdom and more a collection of private ducal properties.
So by 1388, Charles VI is 20. He must have been acutely aware that his uncles were bankrupting the country in his name.
Absolutely. And the sources describe this moment in 1388 as Charles finally showing this powerful, decisive moment of political maturity. He saw the damage.
And he acted.
He did. Publicly and dramatically, he dismissed his corrupt uncles. He effectively stripped them of their governmental authority and took the reins of power himself. It was a bit late, but he did it with great conviction.
And what he did next was brilliantly strategic. He restored the highly competent advisors of his father, the men often dismissively called the marmosets.
The marmosets, yes. The word means something like little men or little boys. It was a derogatory term the powerful dukes used to describe these, lower nobility but highly educated and loyal administrators.
Men like Bureau de la Rivière and Olivier de Clisson.
Exactly. But these little men were incredibly effective. They immediately began restoring financial order, simplifying the tax code, and enforcing strict accountability on all royal spending.
And this marks a really critical 4-year period. The sources describe it as ushering in a new period of high esteem for the crown.
And it was during this brief time that the young, competent king earned that first positive and, in hindsight, tragically ironic nickname from his subjects, Charles the Beloved.
For a moment, it really must have appeared that the House of Valois was not only stable, but was actually poised for a new era of success.
That's why this period is so important to understand. It shows that Charles VI had the capacity to be a strong, effective ruler. He wasn't, destined for madness from birth. His successful 4 years prove he possessed the political intelligence to govern.
Which just makes the eventual collapse due to his illness all the more devastating for the kingdom.
It is genuinely tragic, knowing that this brief shining moment was just a prelude to utter psychological and political darkness. That era of competency was so fragile, and it collapsed in the most spectacular fashion in 1392.
So the period of stable, successful rule ends abruptly in August 1392. This is the year that marks the clear onset of his debilitating psychosis.
And it was triggered by a military campaign. He was heading to the Duchy of Brittany.
Why Brittany?
The king was absolutely incensed because his dear friend and one of his key marmoset advisors, Olivier de Clisson.
The Constable of France.
Right. Clisson had survived an assassination attempt orchestrated by a man named Pierre de Craon. Craon then took refuge with John V, the Duke of Brittany, who refused to hand him over.
So Charles took it personally.
very personally. He insisted on punishing the Duke himself, and some sources suggest this was an early sign of a kind of manic fixation. He seemed to be in a frantic fever to start the campaign, ignoring his physician's advice to rest.
The sources paint a really disturbing picture of his psychological state, even before they set off.
They do. Contemporaries noted that Charles was already showing signs of distraction, his speech was disjointed. The army set off on July 1st, 1392, but the slow pace and the intense summer heat just seemed to feed his internal agitation.
Okay, so let's unpack this incredibly dramatic scene that happened near Le Mans in August 1392. This is the moment history recorded his first true public breakdown.
The buildup is just critical. The royal procession is riding through this hot, humid forest, and they're suddenly confronted by this figure. He's described as a barefoot leper, dressed in rags, who just rushes out of the trees.
And he grabs the king's bridle. The nerve of that.
Incredible. And he starts screaming at the king, "Ride no further, noble king. Turn back. You are betrayed."
Wow.
The king's guards managed to beat the man back, but they didn't capture him. And he continued to shadow the procession for nearly half an hour, just repeating this frantic warning over and over.
So that immediately establishes this state of intense paranoia and tension among the entire escort.
Completely. And then came the physical trigger. The thing that finally broke Charles's already stressed mind.
What was it?
As the company emerged from the dense woods into the full heat of the midday sun, a page, maybe he was tired, maybe careless, he dropped the king's lance.
And it made a loud noise.
A very loud noise. The weapon clanged against a steel helmet being carried by another page nearby.
And that seemingly minor sound was the catalyst for the whole catastrophe.
It was the breaking point. The sound, combined with the heat, the stress, and that chilling warning from the leper. Charles just shuddered violently. He instantly drew his sword
And started yelling.
screaming, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy!"
And he attacked his own men.
He attacked without discrimination. He genuinely believed they were the traitors the leper had warned him about. The sources confirm he killed several men, including a knight known as the Bastard of Polignac.
My God. How did they stop him?
It took the combined strength of his chamberlains and soldiers to finally drag him from his horse and subdue him. He then just collapsed. He fell into a profound coma.
What a terrifying and incredibly public display of instability. The political consequences must have been devastating.
Immediate and total. He was carried, unconscious, to the nearby castle of Creil. The political reality was crystal clear. The successful rule of the Marmosets was over. The sources say he was instantly placed back under the regency of the powerful Dukes of Berry and Burgundy.
So the clock was turned back to 1388, but this time the crown itself was broken.
Exactly. And the incident near Le Mans was just the beginning. From 1392 until his death 30 years later, Charles VI cycled constantly between these brief, precious periods of lucidity and intense mental instability. Stable governance became impossible.
So what were some of the other bizarre manifestations of his psychosis?
The sheer variety of his delusions is what makes this case so medically compelling. Just a few months after Le Mans, in 1393, he experienced this profound amnesia.
He didn't know who he was.
Didn't have a clue. When his wife, Queen Isabeau, came to his bedside, he genuinely did not recognize her. He asked his servants who this woman was and ordered them to remove her so he could be left alone. He couldn't remember his own name or the fact that he was the King of France.
Can you imagine the horror of the court, realizing their sovereign doesn't even know he's the sovereign?
It's terrifying, and the subsequent delusions took on these almost mythical qualities. It showed he still retained some fragments of his royal and religious education. Well, around 1395 to 96, he developed these highly specific delusions. For a time, he claimed he was St. George, the patron saint of chivalry. He started demanding that his coat of arms be changed to a lion with a sword thrust through it.
And he would recognize some people, but not others.
That's one of the strangest parts. During these episodes, he would often recognize the minor officers of his household, the squires, the valets, but remain utterly detached from his own wife and his children. It suggests a very selective, or maybe even a defensive form of memory and recognition.
And then, of course, there's the most famous delusion, the one that truly captured the imagination for centuries. The glass delusion.
The documentation for this is incredible. It comes not just from chroniclers, but from Pope Pius II, who wrote about it in his commentaries. Charles VI sometimes genuinely believed his body was made of glass.
That he would shatter if he experienced any kind of impact.
Exactly, and that is such a powerful and specific mental image.
What did he do to, protect himself?
He reportedly took these extraordinary measures. He had iron rods sewn into his clothes, essentially creating a kind of internal cage around his body.
So that if he bumped into a person or a piece of furniture?
The metal structure would absorb the shock, and his glass body would remain intact. This kind of persistent protective behavior really demonstrates the absolute conviction he held in this delusion.
Beyond these dramatic delusions, his illness eventually led to just sheer self-neglect, which must have further isolated him from his role as king.
By 1405, the self-neglect became impossible to hide. The sources state he refused to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months straight.
5 months.
5 months. At his residence, the Hotel St. Paul, he would sometimes experience these periods of manic running, just wildly sprinting through the corridors. It created such a state of chaos and danger that eventually they had to physically wall up the doorways.
To keep him confined, his court effectively became a padded cell for the king.
It did. Now, given the dramatic and varied nature of his illness, doctors and historians have been trying to diagnose it for centuries.
I can imagine. What are the main theories?
Well, the lack of a unified diagnosis is a big part of the story. When modern psychiatry emerged in the 19th century, the default assumption for any historical royal instability was, schizophrenia.
The general term for severe psychosis.
Right. But more specific alternatives have been proposed based on the source descriptions. Things like manic depressive psychosis, what we now call bipolar disorder, which would account for the cycles between frenetic activity, like the campaign to Brittany, and then deep comas or amnesia.
And there were more physical theories too, right?
Yes. Some have suggested severe arsenic poisoning, maybe administered inadvertently or maliciously. The sudden, violent onset supports that idea. Then there's typhus-induced encephalopathy.
Typhus.
Typhus is interesting because it could explain both the fits of delirium and the chronicler's mentions of rashes or skin issues. And finally, porphyria, a metabolic disorder, is another classic, though maybe overused, historical diagnosis for royal madness.
So a single, definitive diagnosis will probably forever remain out of reach.
I think so. But the political impact was immediate and measurable. The one constant through these years was the desperate attempt by those close to him to maintain some semblance of order.
Which brings us to Pierre Salmon, his secretary.
Exactly. Salmon spent a lot of time with the king during his lucid periods. And his response wasn't medical, it was philosophical and political. He oversaw the production of these two magnificent, richly illuminated versions of his dialogues.
They're basically guidebooks for good kingship.
That's right. Manuals designed to remind Charles of his duty and perhaps through literature to help stabilize this deeply volatile kingdom. It was a very courtly, intellectual attempt to fight chaos.
Speaking of chaos, let's transition from the king's personal breakdown to the massive public spectacle that solidified the public's view of the court as unstable and reckless. The Bal des Ardents.
The Dance of the Burning Men. This happened in January 1393, just months after the incident near Le Mans.
And it was organized by Queen Isabeau of Bavaria.
Yes, at the Hotel St. Paul to celebrate a lady-in-waiting's wedding. It was meant to be a moment of levity, to try and mask the underlying anxiety about the king.
But the choice of costume was disastrously ill-advised. A reckless attempt at entertainment.
It was almost unbelievably dangerous. The king and 4 other young lords decided to dress as wild men. The sources are very specific about this. Linen cloth was sewn directly onto their bodies. And then this cloth was soaked in pitch or resinous wax to make it sticky. That allowed them to cover themselves completely in frazzled hemp so they looked shaggy and hairy.
And, crucially, highly flammable.
Incredibly flammable. The king made a rule that no torches were to be brought into the room, ostensibly for safety, but
everyone ignored it.
Immediately disregarded. The king's younger brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, arrived late with his own entourage. He was excited, maybe a bit drunk, and he approached the masked dancers with a lighted torch, trying to figure out who they were.
And he accidentally set one of the costumes on fire.
And the panic must have been horrifying. It was instant and absolute. The flames spread from man to man in seconds.
But the king was saved.
Through a miraculous act of quick thinking. His aunt, the Duchess of Berry, recognized him and instantly threw the heavy train of her gown over Charles, smothering the flames and shielding him from the blaze.
The others weren't so lucky.
4 of the dancers perished horribly. One man, Jean, son of the Lord of Nantouillet, saved his own life by jumping headfirst into a large open tub of dishwater. The tragedy was complete and very, very public.
The public reaction must have been one of profound shock and outrage.
It was. The court, led by the Queen and the now returned dukes, was seen not only as politically incompetent, but as morally decadent. This horrific fire just solidified the notion that the king and his government were cursed, incapable of providing safety or stability.
The era of the beloved was truly over.
Replaced by the grim reality of the mad.
So now we move from the king's personal tragedy to the political catastrophe that followed. With Charles VI cycling between states of being functional and non-functional, the Regency Council, which was dominated by Queen Isabeau, became the focus of this desperate power struggle from 1393 onward.
The rivalry was so intense because the stakes were, well, total control over the French treasury and military. Initially, Philip the Bold of Burgundy still had a lot of influence over the Queen.
But that influence began to shift.
It shifted significantly towards the king's younger brother, Louis XIII, Duke of Orleans.
Louis of Orleans was charismatic, ambitious, and he actively wanted the regency. And crucially, the sources strongly suggest that he was the Queen's lover.
Which added this layer of scandalous personal animosity to the political feud against Philip the Bold.
And this internal struggle immediately resulted in the dismissal of those competent marmosets that Charles had installed.
Yes, order was replaced by patronage and pure self-interest. The underlying rivalry was between this increasingly powerful, centralized, and tax-heavy government faction led by Orleans.
And the powerful, decentralized, more populist faction, often allied with the communes of Paris, led by Burgundy.
And that rivalry intensified massively when Philip the Bold died in 1404. His son, John the Fearless, inherited the title and his father's political aims, but with a far more ruthless edge. The feud with Louis of Orleans became this open, defining conflict.
But before this conflict exploded into full-blown civil war, the court, which really reflected the arbitrary and unstable nature of the Regency, issued a devastating decree in 1394.
The complete expulsion of the Jews from France.
This was a sudden and shocking ordinance published on September 17, 1394. What was the pretext for such a sweeping, irreversible action?
The official rationale was based on these long-standing complaints of alleged excesses and misdemeanors committed by the Jewish community against Christians. Prosecutors supposedly found evidence that the community had broken prior oaths and agreements made with the king.
But the chronicler, the monk of St. Denis, cast some serious doubt on whether the king genuinely assented to this.
He does. He claims that Charles VI, during a lucid moment, signed the decree only at the absolute persistent insistence of Queen Isabeau.
Which puts the decision squarely in the realm of court manipulation, not rational governance.
Exactly. And the decree, which was framed as an irrevocable law and statute, stipulated that no Jew could dwell in Charles VI's domains. And the enforcement details in the sources, they reveal the harsh financial motivation behind the whole thing.
Walk us through that enforcement process.
The Jews were given a very brief respite, a short time to sell off their fixed property and settle their existing debts. The critical part, though, concerned money owed to the Jews. Those who were indebted to them were given a set short time to redeem their obligations. If they failed to pay, the pledges the Jews held were to be sold off quickly.
So the financial catastrophe for the Jewish community was sealed by what the king did next, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the debt cancellation.
Precisely. Once the Jews were forced to sell what they could and were escorted to the frontier by the provost, the king then officially released all Christians from their remaining debts to the now expelled Jews.
So it was a massive wealth transfer disguised as a religious decree.
That's exactly what it was. It guaranteed that the departing community would leave France financially crippled, and it marked the definitive end of the Jewish presence in France until the time of the Revolution. A politically expedient and financially cruel measure.
And this political environment, just rife with ambition, debt, and this factional hatred, it all culminated in the assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407.
This was the moment the rivalry turned into open war. It happened right in the heart of Paris, in the Rue Vieille du Temple. Louis of Orleans was ambushed and brutally murdered.
And John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, he didn't even try to hide his involvement.
Not at all. In fact, he publicly claimed responsibility and then provided this cynical justification for the act.
What was the justification? This is critical. He essentially had to frame regicide, the murder of the king's own brother, as some kind of moral necessity.
He commissioned theologians and legal scholars, most famously a man named Jean Petit, to issue these elaborate justifications in the form of pamphlets. Petit argued that Orléans wasn't just a political opponent, but a financial tyrant who had systematically squandered royal money and committed treason.
So John the Fearless wasn't a murderer.
No, he was an agent of public justice, a tyrannicide. He was removing a corrupt threat to the public good and to the king himself.
That's the language of propaganda, isn't it?
Yep.
Designed to appeal to the Parisian populace who had suffered under Orléans' high taxes.
Absolutely. But despite the theological cover, the act was still viewed as a blood crime by Orléans' heirs, and the war began immediately.
Yes, the assassination was the fuse that lit the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, which would tear France apart for decades.
Orléans' son, Charles, who became the next Duke of Orléans and a famous poet, was too young to lead. So he immediately sought support from his powerful father-in-law, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac.
And just like that, France was formally and brutally split in two.
You had the Armagnacs, representing the Orléans party, and the Bourguignons, the Burgundy party. And the Bourguignons consistently controlled the capital, Paris.
And most importantly, they controlled the person of the tragically afflicted King Charles VI.
And the king, during his moments of lucidity, was forced to oscillate between legitimizing one side or the other. He'd issued decrees that were immediately reversed when the opposing factions seized control of Paris.
This constant, bloody, localized fighting with massacres and terror enacted on the Parisian population.
It left the French crown utterly incapable of defending itself against foreign enemies. The focus had turned completely, fatally inward.
And that internal fracturing was the open invitation that Henry V of England had been waiting for. By 1415, he's looking across the channel and seeing a France that's leaderless, divided, and bleeding itself dry.
This was the moment to reignite the 100 Years' War in earnest. And he wasn't just fighting for land anymore. He was fighting for the entire French throne.
The renewed English invasion culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Agincourt in October 1415.
It was a military disaster, of course, but fundamentally it was a political failure. The divided French leadership, composed of Armagnac and Burgundian-leaning nobles who could barely stand to be in the same camp, they made one critical strategic error after another.
They fielded this massive, heavily armored force, but the sources all indicate this profound lack of unified command and coordination.
Which Henry V, with his disciplined archers, exploited ruthlessly. The result was devastating. The loss of life among the French aristocracy was just crippling. It gutted the military and administrative leadership of the Valois dynasty.
The Constable of France himself, Charles d'Albret, was killed, along with thousands of knights and nobles.
This single battle just hollowed out the French state's ability to recruit, command, and fund any future resistance. It left a massive power vacuum right at the top of society.
And with the military so weakened, the Civil War only intensified. In 1418, the Burgundians seized Paris in a bloody coup.
And the Dauphin Charles, the king's heir, he was forced to flee south, escaping barely with his life.
This political instability just kept producing these cycles of violence. John the Fearless, now controlling Paris and the king, he actually attempted to solidify his power by negotiating a truce with the Dauphin Charles.
Yes, hoping to unite against the common English enemy.
The two leaders met at the bridge at Montereau on September 10, 1419. It sounds like this was meant to be the ultimate peace conference.
It was supposed to be a reconciliation, but the memory of Orléans' murder was too fresh. The distrust was just too deep, and during the meeting, John the Fearless was murdered.
By one of the Dauphin's followers, Tanneguy de Chastel.
It was assassination as revenge.
So the Armagnacs retaliated with an assassination of their own, cementing this cycle of royal violence, and the consequences for France were immediate, total, and fatal.
Absolutely fatal. John the Fearless's successor, his son Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, was utterly enraged. And he reacted not with another attempt at revenge, but with geopolitical finality.
He allied himself with Henry V.
Completely and irrevocably. The alliance between Burgundy, which controlled Paris and the king's person, and England, which controlled the military, created an unstoppable political force.
And this alliance led directly to the ultimate act of state betrayal. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21st, 1420.
Charles VI, in one of his lucid but politically helpless periods, essentially signed away the French crown to the English.
The terms were unambiguous and just devastating for the Valois line.
The treaty formally named Henry V of England as Charles VI's successor. It stipulated that Henry's heirs, not the French Dauphin, would inherit the throne of France, thus unifying the crowns of England and France.
And it officially disinherited the Dauphin Charles, the true French heir, who was only 17 at the time. It denied him his birthright.
And to cement the whole agreement, Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, was betrothed to Henry V. This political marriage ensured that their child would possess a valid genealogical claim to both thrones, based on a treaty signed by the French king himself.
So the disinherited Dauphin, who had set up this, pathetic but persistent rival court in Bourges, was then subjected to a vicious propaganda campaign by the powerful Burgundian faction.
Yes. By 1421, the Burgundian propagandists went beyond just citing the treaty. They began strongly implying that the young Charles VII was illegitimate.
A direct political attack, likely fueled by those old rumors of Queen Isabeau's affair with Louis of Orleans.
Exactly. If they could convince the populace that the Dauphin was not the son of Charles VI, then the disinheritance would be legally and morally justified. The entire fate of France hinged on the mental instability of one man and the alleged infidelities of his wife.
The sources also mention the broader imperial context, which shows just how fragmented French authority had become.
Indeed, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, he sensed this complete collapse of French authority and tried to exploit the chaos to reassert imperial control over French border territories.
In 1421, he appointed an imperial vicar for the Kingdom of Burgundy, or Arles.
Yes, a man named Louis II of Chalon-Arles. And for those unfamiliar with the title, an imperial vicar was basically a temporary representative with military and judicial authority over the region.
So the Holy Roman Empire, which bordered France to the east, was trying to install its own man.
They were trying to detach territories like Dauphiné and Provence, claiming they fell under imperial jurisdiction. It was a clear sign that foreign powers believed the French crown was completely incapable of governing its own eastern domains. The attempt ultimately failed, but it highlights just how vulnerable France was perceived to be.
The final chapter of Charles VI's life is marked by the strange irony of timing. Henry V of England, the man legally designated to inherit the French throne, died first.
In August 1422, it was a pivotal twist of fate.
Because just weeks later, Charles VI, the source of so much national tragedy, he died on October 21st, 1422, in Paris at the Hotel St. Paul.
So because Henry V had died first, the succession, at least in law, according to the Treaty of Troyes, passed to Henry V's infant son.
The 9-month-old Henry VI of England. The English and Burgundians controlled Paris, and Henry VI was subsequently proclaimed King of France.
And he was later crowned in Notre Dame in 1431. France technically had an English king.
But the fight was far from over. The disinherited Dauphin, Charles, who refused to accept the treaty, he continued the fight from his rival court in Bourges.
And he was widely regarded by the vast majority of the French people and loyalists as the true rightful heir. They called him the King of Bourges.
The national war now shifted focus entirely. It wasn't a civil war between Armagnacs and Bourguignons anymore.
It became a fight for national survival against the English occupation. And it was ultimately the arrival and leadership of Joan of Arc that galvanized the French forces.
She led the Dauphin's armies to these crucial victories, demonstrating what was seen as divine favor for the French cause.
And that allowed for Charles's symbolic, powerful coronation as King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral in 1429, the traditional site for French kings deep within English-held territory.
And Charles VII eventually succeeded where his father had failed. He proved himself to be an excellent and determined king. He ultimately defeated the English entirely by 1450, finally ending the 100 Years' War and living up to the new title history gave him, Charles the Victorious. #outro. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really worth summarizing the direct lineage of Charles VI, because his tragedy created this incredible web of geopolitical relationships that affected not just France, but England as well.
His marriage to Isabeau of Bavaria in 1385, it produced a large number of children. It's a testament to the fact that even amidst psychosis and civil war, dynastic duties continued.
Several children died young, including 3 Dauphins who never lived to inherit the crown. But the surviving children's marriages were profoundly strategic.
The sources highlight several key dynastic bonds. Their daughter Isabella first married Richard II of England, and then later married Charles, Duke of Orleans.
The son of the man murdered by the Duke of Burgundy.
The very same. Another daughter, Michelle, married Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, solidifying that deadly alliance between the House of Valois and Burgundy, the one which nearly destroyed France.
And of course, Catherine of Valois. She became the political centerpiece of the Treaty of Troyes, marrying Henry V of England.
Her marriage produced Henry VI, the infant king of both nations, who had to be physically crowned in both London and Paris.
But Catherine's story has a secondary, equally massive legacy for England.
It does. After Henry V's death, she allegedly married a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. Through this union, she became the grandmother of Henry VII.
The founder of the powerful Tudor dynasty in England.
Exactly. So the children of Charles Mad influenced both the ending of the Valois period in France and the beginning of the Tudor period across the Channel.
It is a history just saturated in political manipulation and personal frailty. Charles VI's reign stands as one of the lowest, most vulnerable periods for the House of Valois.
It's a terrifying historical lesson. The profound, debilitating mental illness of one king metastasized into national failure, permitting foreign invasion and internal civil war to nearly obliterate the most powerful monarchy in Western Europe.
His madness created the power vacuum.
His madness allowed the dukes to steal the treasury. His madness allowed Henry V to claim a legitimate right to the French throne. It forces us to acknowledge just how fragile the entire system of medieval governance was, resting on the stability of a single, highly privileged individual.
Which brings us right back to where we began with that crucial, unsettling question. We spend so much time analyzing history through grand economic tides, deep social structures, or inevitable dynastic decay.
But Charles VI's story forces you to stop and ask, how much of the fate of nations, that's a survival of dynasties and the continuation of centuries-long conflicts, can truly hinge upon the random, unpredictable chaos contained within the mental health of a single individual?
It's a profound thought. The English conquered France not just because of superior strategy, but because their main opponent was incapacitated by a psychological illness.
The most consequential 42 years of 15th century French history were dictated by the state of Charles VI's mind, a state that swung violently between the beloved and the mad.
A truly profound and deeply unsettling historical reality. Thank you for taking this complex, dramatic deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.